at it, your certified life and wellness coach. And this week, like many weeks, but this week I have a special treat. We have Dr. Samantha Brody on the show. And Dr. Samantha Brody is a licensed naturopathic physician and acupuncturist, and the founder of Evergreen Natural Health Center in Portland, Oregon. For decades in her private practice and virtual coaching consulting business, Dr. Samantha has helped thousands of people transform their lives with innovative personalized approach. She is the author of Overcoming Overwhelm, a book that is well loved by me, Dismantle Your Stress from the Inside Out. And you can find her online at www.drsamantha.com. I'll have all that information in the show notes. She has been featured as an expert in publications on sites such as the Wall Street Journal, Huffington Post, Shape, Live Strong, the LA Times, Natural Living Today, For Women First, Prevention Health Books, The Metro Parent, and now she's on the Love Your Life show. Let's welcome Samantha. All right, warriors. Well, here's a special guest for you, Dr. Samantha Brody. And Dr. Samantha, I am thrilled to have you on the show today and to be a part of our Love Your Life community. Thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm excited to be here.
Yay. Well, I am wondering if you could just dive right in. You wrote this wonderful book on overcoming overwhelm that I have, and I have loved dearly.
Oh, look at all the little sticky notes. I love that.
I love it. That's how I love my books. And could you tell me a little bit, and the listeners a little bit, about how you came to write a book on overwhelm?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a naturopathic physician and acupuncturist. I work in Oregon, and in this state, I'm licensed as a primary care provider. So I work kind of just like a Western, kind of a cross between a Western medical and an alternative provider. We call it integrative medicine. So I do pap smears and annual exams and send people for blood work and do regular diagnosis, but I also do deep dives into what's causing the issues. How can we treat that more naturally if there's an option? What are the lifestyle things that we want to look at? And I'm about to head into my 24th year of practice.
Wow.
And what I found in my practice was that over and over and over again, I was finding that people were coming up against the same challenges around making change. And I found that this kind of accumulation of stress that people were dealing with and facing in their lives was impacting them in a way that it was affecting their health profoundly. And until we lowered the overall load, it was hard to make change. And then people felt like they were failing. And so I developed this process with people to really look at what was most important. And I wanted to figure out a way to, do a lot of public speaking and writing and freelance. And I was working for years to try to figure out a way to kind of systematize it in order to be able to reach more people, because there are only a certain number of people who can work with me face-to-face in my office or even in my virtual coaching and consulting practice. So I started to try to figure out a way to kind of coalesce the information. I started doing that in talks. And then I decided that it was time to do the book. I'd been working on different book proposals for years and would get really far into it. And actually there's one on hormones that I was like ready to roll with. And then I'm like, oh, this isn't it. And so I kind of went back to the drawing board, and the concept was called Stress 2.0 at that time, kind of looking at stress differently. And I did my book proposal and, ended up, signed with an agent. We pitched it to, all of the publishing houses, and rejection over rejection. And then finally Sounds True Publishing came back to me and said, we love the concept. We don't think a book on stress is really going to sell. What other ways can this be reframed in order to really, people aren't often looking like, how do I fix my stress, right? I mean, they do, but they're looking for something different. And so we started reworking it. I completely redid the proposal again from the ground up, and they were like, great. And we moved forward with it. And so that's kind of how I got there. It's a, coalescing of 20 years of practice.
Well, and that launches right into a question that I have. And what I love about your work is a lot of people interchange overwhelm and stress, or they use the term sort of interchangeably, and you sort of pull them apart. And could you speak a little more about that, the difference between overwhelm and stress?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think about stress is the things globally that impact us that may lead to overwhelm, and then overwhelm being the thing that leads to symptoms. in our physical health, emotional health, just general well-being. So stresses fall into different categories for me. So environmental stress, nutritional stress, the stress of trauma from your past, the stress of a difficult relationship or even a great relationship. And what happens is when our ability to handle all of that stress exceeds what our bodies and minds are able to handle, it then becomes overwhelm. And, you know, part of that is just being on the planet for a certain amount of time, right? You know, there's like gravity, it just impacts us more and more over time. So I really try to separate stress and overwhelm out, because stress is not a bad thing. We have stress all the time. It's important to keep us driven, but overwhelm isn't a good thing. Being overwhelmed weighs us down in a way that we end up not being able to do the things we want to do, because that's the thing that makes us feel poorly. So stress is not inherently bad. And I mean, I say overwhelmed not inherently bad either, just because that can drive us to make changes as well, right? Sometimes we have to get to a point where we go, wow, my life isn't working. It doesn't look like what I want it to look like. And that often, you know, kind of, I think about overwhelm as being something that we all experience, even when people don't say I feel overwhelmed, because overwhelm can manifest as headaches or digestive issues or fatigue or trouble sleeping or, you know, and some people get this kind of anxious, kind of I'm stressed, you know, vibe about them, and other people just shut down. And so overwhelm is really varies from person to person how it's going to manifest. And the stress I think about more is the things that lead to that. Does that make sense?
And I love how you differentiate between that, especially in your book, because I do point out to myself and my kids and my clients that stress isn't necessarily, as you just said, a bad thing. Like before, you know, an interview, I might feel a little stressed, but that's because it's like, oh, you got to, you know, make sure you got your interview questions ready, or before trying out for a new team, or before having that conversation with your partner that's going to, you know, lead you to that next level. You might feel a little of that stress, but then you speak of how those stresses sort of add up and how we can, you know, about a bucket, which I'll let you talk about, but and that's sort of what I look at, is like, which stresses do we want on there and which ones is it like, okay, not.
Yeah, what are we choosing? You know, there are things that are stressful about life. You know, are most people in one way or another, our jobs are stressful, and one way or another, our relationships are stressful, and one way or another, what we eat is stressful, right? Are we eating, you know, are we choosing to eat something that we know our bodies don't really love? We do that all the time. And that's okay. We're grown-ups. We get to do what we want most of the time,
Right.
You know, barring breaking the law, you know, we get to make our choices, and it's okay to make choices that may not serve us. And it's a question of, well, where are your lines? What are your values? How do you want to line that all up?
I love that. And so could you explain your bucket theory a little on how it?
Yeah, sure. So I think about our ability to handle stress as being a bucket. And some people are born with little tiny buckets. Other people are born with great big buckets. And there are ways to change that over time, but not very many. You know, if you go and meditate for an hour a day for 20 years, that might change your bucket size. But for the most part, you kind of get what you get, which is why you'll see two people in a similar situation, and one person is going completely off the rails, and the other person's like, all right, good. It's hard. It's hard. I'm good. You know, and of course, trauma impacts that in your own history, but you know, all other things equal, people are going to handle it differently. So we have this bucket, and different things fill up that bucket. And when the bucket overflows, we end up manifesting whatever symptom it is we're disposed to, whether that's a physical symptom, an emotional symptom, spiritual, you know, challenge, whatever that is, however you roll with those things. And so the different things go in the bucket, and in the bucket, in all the categories, everything can be defined as in one of three ways: things we can change, things we can't change, or things we choose not to change, right? Really important, the things we choose not to change, because there are going to be a million things that cause us stress. And there are going to be some things where we just go, okay, this is something I'm just going to say I'm not going to change right now. I'm not going to do anything about this. I'm going to just accept it, whether it's a small thing or a big thing. So back to the bucket. There are different categories in the bucket. And some of those categories are things we have a lot of things we can change and have control over, and other things not so much. So the first thing I always say is in the bucket is your genetics, because that's the foundation here. And you can't change your genetics, but you can change how you interact with your genetics. It's called epigenetics, right? How your environment intersects with your genetic dispositions. And so you could lower your stress load and be less likely to manifest certain things you're genetically disposed to. Some things are just going to happen no matter what. The next thing is your history. Can't change your history. I mean, as far as I know, in my worldview,
Right.
whatever happened, but we can change how we interact with that. Do we process our trauma doing some kind of therapy like EMDR? Do we decide we're not going to let our past undo us? Do we look at how someone treated us and say, wow, that was crappy, and I'm not going to hold it against that person. I'm going to work to rebuild that relationship. Or do we say, I'm just going to make these boundaries and not have a relationship, right? All those things. So that's how we interact with our past. And then some of the things I mentioned before, nutritional stress, which can be, your macronutrients, your micronutrients, your sensitivities, when you eat, what you eat, the environment, which is both the, the air around us and the water we drink, but also, the guy in the next cubicle over who's like chewing on his gum, or, the traffic situation, or, anything. My kid is playing saxophone and oh my gosh.
I had a saxophone player.
Oh, kid. So, and then we have a relationship stress and financial stress. And often when I start talking about all the things that fill the bucket, and it varies, some of the things are common across cultural paradigms, and then other things are different from person to person. Often people will start to feel overwhelmed when I talk about all the things in the bucket. But the key is that when we understand all of the things that are causing us stress, when we're taking stock of that, when we're really clear about the accumulation of things, we're then able to say, oh, this is something I can change, and this is something I can't. This is something that's important to me and in alignment with my values to do or not do this. And this is something that really isn't as important, even though, for years I had on my kind of to-do list was learning Spanish, and it was at the top of the list. And finally, after, my kid is fluent in Spanish, she went to immersion school, and after, I'm going to say that was at the top of my list for like 9 years. I was like, why is this on my list? I'm not going to do it right now.
I'll just bring him with me. Right.
Yeah. And yeah, as if he's going to help. So we were, he gets embarrassed when I try to speak Spanish. So when we go anywhere, it's like, so, it's something that I felt like was important to me, but when I really dug in and looked, and that's one of the things I do in the book, is I actually take people through a start to finish process of assessing what's most important to them so they can decide what they want to do and not do. This just isn't important enough now. And I went and I put a pin in it. And, I was actually just looking before we started talking, right next to me, I received the bookshelves. So right next to me is the Spanish shelf. And I probably got 15 books, learning Spanish books. And I was looking at today saying, you know what? I don't think that's going to happen. And if it does, I'm probably not going to use those books, or I can get another book. So except for my college Spanish book, which I think is kind of fun to keep, I'm going to give that away and make a blank shelf to maybe put some more art in, or more books, whatever that is. And so, it's things change, seasons change, and being aware and conscious allows us to prioritize in a way that we can line our choices up with our values.
Yeah, well, I want to get into your process for overwhelm, but first I want to just go back to what you were saying about this, how there are things we can change, there are things we can't change, and things we choose not to change or choose to change. Because that, for me, it was sort of this aha moment about 10 years ago, just, all the things that it's like, oh my gosh, I have a choice. Or even, your son with the saxophone. Okay, so it's driving you insane. You have a choice. You could say, son, you can't practice at home. And then there are consequences to that, but you're choosing, you're like, well, I'd like, I don't want to, so you have them at home, and then you can just view it through a different lens. Like, this is happening. Let's see what's happening. What is another example of things that you might choose not to change?
Sure. I'm actually going to touch on the saxophone thing one more time, because there are a couple other options that when I really say, okay, this is something that's causing me stress, I can save up for noise canceling headphones. I can go work in the basement while he's up here practicing. I can take a walk. There's so many things that instead of saying, oh, this is so stressful, it's so stressful, saying, okay, well, how can I think outside the box? Other things could be, I am not going to stop eating sugar, right? I know that it makes me feel crappy, but right now I don't have the tools to make that change. Or I am not going to, so many things that we could choose.
Well, I'm thinking with the job, I hear people complaining about their job, and it's like, all right, you can leave. And they're like, oh, okay, and then just to be aware, well, you're choosing not to leave because of what? The paycheck, or because of the convenience?
Whatever, or a marriage.
Right.
Like I'm choosing to stay right now and I have a patient that I'm working with who is choosing to stay in her marriage solely for financial reasons. And
Mm,
she feels terribly guilty about that. But I'm, you know what? You get to make the choice. You're a grown up. It's okay. Don't judge yourself.
yeah.
Deciding you're going to stay, feeling badly about it, and then judging yourself
Not helpful.
worse than just staying or just leaving,
Mhm.
right? So the burden that we put on ourselves around not, our shoulds, right? Don't should on yourself. I mean,
Don't should
I
on
hate to
yourself.
meme that up, but
Mm,
it's very, the moment of this is just where I am. And also though, to say, if you're truly doing something that doesn't line up with your values, and maybe that is staying in a job that you hate, maybe it's staying in a relationship that's emotionally abusive, there are places where our values are going to say it's most important to me to stay in this relationship because I have kids and I don't care how unhappy I am.
mm,
But there are places that we can then say, all right, is this something that I can tolerate, and decide that this is something for now that I'm going to tolerate. And one of the actually sections in the book in the bucket is called tolerations, like things that we
mm,
put up with that cause us stress for putting up with it. So you can either choose, and some often they're little things, and you can choose to change or not change it, or you can choose to say, I'm just gonna, I'm choosing to not change this. Therefore, it's no longer a toleration. It's something that I'm choosing. And taking responsibility for yourself is hard. I mean, people fight
yeah.
that tooth and nail. It's not human nature. It's human nature to blame other people. And
Yeah.
it's a lot of work to get to a place where like, I'm going to take responsibility for my choices, and I'm going to own that this is what I'm doing right now. And I think that's a really important piece here, is to kind of be able to do that. Of course, I'm not saying we're responsible for our own traumas, because there are situations where we really are not, and we don't have choices. And because of the color of our skin, or because of our socioeconomic status, or because of the way we grew up, or whatever those things, or our religion, whatever those things are that kind of put us in a box of, this is something that I really don't, we may not be able to change for one reason or another, but we can change how we interact with it. We can
Mm,
decide, okay, here's what I can do about it, or this is something that really there's nothing I can do about this. So what else what else can give?
yeah. Well, and that also brings up what you were saying earlier about the past. And it's always, our choice as to how to view the past. And I know,
Right.
I on my own, for my own personal experience, I've worked a lot on how I choose to view the past. And now I view it from a place that makes me feel really empowered and proud. And I'm like,
Right.
okay, that feels much better. And I
Right.
have people that tell me that's delusional, and and I'm like, it's really not, because it
Right.
happened. I'm not going to argue with the past. And here I am in the present. And how do I want to feel? And
Right.
I think that leads us perfectly into what the pieces of your book that I just so grab onto and love, and that's in alignment with my work, is how you speak of values and you speak of the feelings. And I so often encourage people, even when you wake up, like, how do you want to feel today when you go to bed? Then what do you want to do to get there? And your book leads us through that perfectly. And can you tell us a little more about your
Yeah,
process?
absolutely. So the book starts with just kind of reframing stress and overwhelm in the way that we've talked about. And then I actually walk people through a process of identifying what their values are. I'm actually going to provide that exercise a link for your listeners in the show notes.
Oh, yay. Thank
So
you.
sure.
That's
So the first step we do is we look at what our values are and what's most important to us, and remembering that that can change over time. Shifting values is a sign of an open mind and an open heart, right? We don't have to be stuck in what that is. They change, and they should.
That's really helpful. Just that I don't want to just skate over
No,
that,
no, no,
because
that's
some of
okay.
us, when we're 20 and maybe we have that first marriage, or we have certain values, and then to allow us the freedom and the open-mindedness to say we change. I love that.
Right.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
And really, I mean, I go through that exercise myself every 3 to 4 months, and I find that, the values that I have, I mean, the values tend to be pretty steady, but
Mhm.
there are certain things that will change. As my kid is a teenager, my values are changing around what's most important as far as kind of my work, and my being around for my kid.
Mhm.
Right. And as I finished the book, and this was a huge bucket list item for me. I've been wanting to write a book for as long as I can remember, and to get it traditionally published, and to have, the Pals event with, Pals is a bookstore in Portland, a big independent bookstore, with,
Yay.
they ran out of chairs. It was standing room
Oh,
only, like that. Like I did it. I did that. And so
yeah.
now I get to, now I get to shift gears, and my values are changing around that. And how I want to feel is changing, right? I'm firmly hitting middle age. And, it's, how I want to feel is changing. And so that's kind of the next step too, after the values, is how do we want to feel physically and how do we want to feel emotionally? Because if we don't know what our values are and how we want to feel physically and emotionally, and for those who have a spiritual life spiritually, if we don't know those things, we can't possibly make the right decisions about what we want to do. We can't. And we need to be brutally clear and honest with ourselves about what that is, right? And the example I always give is people talk about, well, I want to be happy. Well, happy is a lot of different things. Happy can be content. Happy can be ebullient or joyous. Happy can be at ease. And so it's going to be different for everyone. And what you want to do to create a state of common ease is very different than, ebullience and excitement, right? Those are very different things. And so, I actually have people go through this process and put their values and how they want to feel on either an index card or a sticky note, and have them in their planner, in the kitchen, in the bathroom, near your computer. So you can actually look at those things and make a habit of thinking about that as we vet our choices, what we say yes to, whether we're going to exercise or rest. And there's a time for each, right?
Yeah.
And so getting, when we're really looking at, well, what are my values and how do I want to feel and what's going to most support that right now? And then the more we do that, the stuff clears off of our to-do list that we don't want to do, either because we take them off, like I did with the Spanish, or because we decide I'm going to delegate that, because it's not something that brings, I hate to say the whole spark joy thing, because a lot of times we have things that we need to do that are crappy, that we don't like, that are not fun.
Right. You still need to.
Yeah, you should see the junk I just cleaned out of my drain.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was a little satisfying, to be perfectly honest,
Yeah.
but to be able to just be really clear about that and to implement it more and more and more as we walk through our lives allows us to line our choices up with our values in a way that we can then live a life that brings us to a place where we love it.
Well, that's the name of this podcast, Living a Life We Love. And I do think it is that simple. It's not easy, but that's what I just love is, taking that sticky note of your values or how you want to feel, and then having it so you keep going back to it. Because earlier you said, you can't make decisions out of alignment, but we do all the time, because
all the time.
Robotic, and someone asks us to bake the cupcakes, even though, I don't know where my muffin tin is, and I'm like, oh, sure. And then it's like, wait a minute, that's not. And
Right.
so it's to pause and keep bringing back into our consciousness this, okay, what is important to me? And, where can I say yes and where can I say no? Because I find otherwise that's when that internal stress and
that's the worst part. Yeah. And I just want to give a shout out to the pause right now, because there's a pause in the moment of, someone asking you something. I have a rule that I don't say yes to anything up front ever, unless it's a gigantic yes and something I've been wanting to do for a long time. It's let me get back to you on that. So I have time to really think about whether that lines up with my values. And I can also, it also gives me the opportunity to send an email, which is a little bit easier sometimes than an in-person no.
Yeah.
Or so that's in the minutia moment, but also the big picture. I've been in this huge pause since my book launched. My book came out in January of this year, and then it was hustle for about 4 or 5 months. In the last 4 months or so, I've just been saying no to everything. No to speaking gigs. I'm saying yes to podcasts because that's something I really love and it's easy when it's a good, when it's an aligned match. And I've been saying yes to all of them, but I've been cutting back on my hours, not taking new clients, and really taking a big picture pause, because without the pause, we really can't take, you need a little bit of space, whether it's in your bucket or in your time or in your emotions or, any of that. We need space to be able to let things settle and say, okay, what is it? What is changing right now, right? If we're constantly, and this is one of the problems with overwhelm, because we're constantly putting out fires without actually taking time to, to really get clear about what we want. And sometimes that just means saying, no, I'm not going to do that right now. And looking at what, one of the other things I talk about in the book is the roadblocks, like what keeps us from doing that.
Yeah. What are some of the common roadblocks that you see that come up?
So perfectionism is a really common roadblock. Fear of disappointing people is a really common roadblock. History of trauma, where we keep repeating the same thing in our lives over and over again because of whatever it is that we went through that like made our brains rut in that direction, right? Our subconscious really wants our external experience to match our internal experience. So often when we when we have a history of trauma, your subconscious is trying to protect us, right? And so it feels safe under certain circumstances that are familiar. And so we create situations in our external environment, whether that's relationships or the saying yes, or, I have a patient who I've been seeing for years. He's just one of my, I shouldn't have favorite patients, but he's like, we're super close. I just adore him. And he has been in this kind of cycle of just like one thing over another happening to him. And he's like, he finally sat down the other day. He's like, all right, my luck can't be this bad. It's just not reasonable for for these things to be happening. And we had a long talk and I said, you know what, we've talked about this before and you've glazed over it, but I think it's really time to dig into some of your trauma, because we see have you ever heard of, The Body Keeps the Score, that book? Yes.
A wonderful book.
So, and I recommend that to everybody, whether they think they've had trauma in their lives or not, because trauma is relative. And, trauma can be your, growing up with a mom who tried to put you on a diet, or growing up in a town where she who's thinnest, prettiest, smartest wins, which is, that was one of my chips from my childhood. And, and sometimes it's more serious than that. And, people will be like, well, it wasn't terrible. My parents got divorced. I was 4, but it was fine. They were really unhappy. And you're like, yeah, that's got to impact you in one way or another. I love that.
Just the point that trauma isn't relative, because I feel that we're so often like, oh, that wasn't really, I remember I had a therapist once say, like, if it feels like trauma to you, it's trauma. Like, you don't need to go gold stamp, like, boom, that's
right. But even if it doesn't feel like trauma, often it is. And that's really important too, to be able to look back and say, if you saw a child experiencing that, would you say, wow, that is too much for a little kid to handle. That's a lot for a little kid to handle, or a young woman to handle, right? Whatever the thing is, I don't want to get into all kinds of horrible stories right now, but, things that really, it's, and it can be one thing that's small that's stuck, right? And then we experience more things that kind of stick to it over time. And so then we end up, that particular patient I was talking about had moved back in with his ex. It was very hard for him to extricate himself from the relationship for many reasons. He's a people pleaser and he didn't want to disappoint her or the kids. The kids were adults, by the way, in their 30s. Wow. Right. But he, felt this really strong commitment. And so he had finally extricated himself. They were living apart. And then he got sick. And then he saw a financial advisor who said, he had not actually gotten divorced. They just separated, who said, I'm concerned about your finances. I don't know when you'll be able to retire. He freaked out and moved back in with her. And, and then, he, more and more things kind of going on in his life that were challenging and difficult. And I'm not going to say moving back in with it, she's a wonderful person and he loves her and she loves him. And, but there's something about not really dealing with what was driving him to not leave the relationship that he wasn't happy in, or that wasn't meeting his needs. And that same kind of trauma manifests in that. And then it also then will start to manifest in other ways. Like if you have high blood pressure and you just take a blood pressure medication, but your blood pressure is high because your diet is not good and you don't exercise, you can take blood pressure medication. You're going to have another issue, right? You're going to have another health issue pop up. It's the same thing with emotional issues and, in general, and the choices that we make. And so often the trauma it can drive our choices in a profound way that we don't even realize it. So, and I will say that the kind of therapy I recommend for that is called EMDR. I don't know if you've heard of that or if you've done it. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Could you say a little bit about that? I know that.
Yeah. So it's eye movement desensitization and reintegration, and it was originally used for post-traumatic stress syndrome with mostly people who had been in the military and had post-traumatic stress, and it worked so well that counselors started using it in other contexts. And I actually recommend it again for also anxiety and depression, in addition to post-traumatic stress, because there's always a trauma component. And it's a way of, instead of talk therapy, which I'm a huge fan of, but often people, especially people who are more cerebral, do talk therapy over talk therapy over talk therapy. But the EMDR and there are other similar body-oriented therapies actually gets the pulls the historical issue out from your subconscious so you can just kind of jettison it instead of having your body just try to encapsulate it and just keep it in a tight little bubble and then do everything it can do to keep you from processing it and letting it go, because that's the familiar.
Wonderful. And I do know that any listeners who are interested, you can Google that and find EMDR practitioners in your area. I know in Northern Virginia, there are several because I've been
all over the place. Yeah. There's the Psychology Today website, weirdly, is the most comprehensive listing for counselors. And you can actually go on there and you can tick boxes to narrow down. So you can put in your zip code, you can put in EMDR and, female counselor and trauma literate, or, whatever the things you click, and your insurance even you can often put in there, and it'll do the vetting for you. And then you can go to the websites. It saves a lot of time.
Wonderful. Thank you for that hint. Can you tell us a little about how you view self-care? Because you view it differently than just sort of manicures and pedicures. And
yeah, for sure. No, I don't want to vilify manicures and pedicures, because having tactics for managing stress are really important too. So whether that's coloring or exercising or mani-pedis or, whatever the thing is, massages, whatever you like, having those two, having those kinds of things that you can do are great. And again, some of them cost money and some of them do not. So just to say that's not, I think sometimes people feel like, well, I can't afford self-care. And that's really, there are lots of things you can do that you don't need to pay someone else for. But that's really not true self-care for me. So that is kind of the surface self-care. The underneath self-care for me is really about making choices that line up with your values. Because truly, when we're making choices that line up with our values, that is the ultimate form of caring for ourselves. Not when we're making choices for ourselves and not for other people as a priority. And again, you can prioritize someone else and have that still be your value, right? So it's not that, say, driving my kid to soccer, that might not be the thing I want to do. It's still self-care because I'm making a choice to line that up with my values. So I have an opportunity to connect with my kid and talk to him.
And then that also brings in that lens of how it's a choice. It's like, look at him choose. So you aren't driving like, it's like, oh no, wait a minute, I chose this. And I love your way of looking at it, because it brings into then what a lot of us do is the self-sabotage, where we're thinking, oh, I'll just hit snooze one more time. Whereas that's self-care is truly waking up when you set your alarm. If you said you were going to walk for 10 minutes before the kids were up, or, then that's the self-care, not the hitting snooze. That's more the...
I actually might challenge that a little, because I would say that, for some people that's the case. For someone else, someone who's really driven, who is, overly rigid as a rule in their lives, then actually hitting the snooze button might be self-care. But that's actually the point. The real point is that it varies from person over person, and it can vary day over day and season over season, right? Or when I'm premenstrual, I'm exhausted, and it does serve me more. Actually, what would really serve me more is setting the alarm for later to begin with, because
I was going to say
more sleep instead of hitting the snooze.
I'm like, because I am very driven and rigid, but I know whatever. I just had back to school night one day this week, and instead of waking up when I normally do, I set my alarm for half an hour later.
Yes.
As self-care. But then when it went off, I wasn't like,
right.
I feel like in the moment it's your animal brain.
The snooze is the worst thing. Is my kid does that. I'm like, why wouldn't you just sleep longer if every day you hit the snooze button? I just cannot wrap my head around that. It's so perplexing to me. I don't know.
Right. But I guess to the point is that this self-sabotage, I have clients who are trying to lose weight, and they get all up in their head, and then they're like, I, don't want to restrict from the cupcake, or they feel like they're holding themselves back from the chips and dip or whatever, versus seeing it as no, this is an alignment. You want to treat your body well. You want to, yes, you get to choose whether you have it, but what is the true self-care here? The true self-care is, having a serving of chips and dip instead of all of them, or choosing something else that is in alignment with your goals and what.
Right. We're choosing to say right now I want the whole bowl of chips and dip, and I'm not going to shame myself, because this is really about health and not about, or whatever the thing is. Right. And so, and it's complicated. It's not easy to get to that. It's a process, right? Of deciding that you're going to be, really loving to yourself is ultimately. And then if we have, the other thing I talk to my patients and clients a lot about is, when we have a goal and say, okay, I'm going to choose not to drink alcohol. keep going back and drinking and making that choice over and over again, either you've made the wrong choice to not drink, or there's something in your way. It's a roadblock. You need to get support, or you need to look at what that trauma is, or you need to say, which is why I always say you cannot fail at self-care. I think a lot of times we feel like, well, I failed at that diet, or I failed at that new program. You can't fail, because it's just gathering information. If you sequentially make choices that don't line up with your values, you're not lazy. There's something getting in your way of being able to do that, and being honest with yourself and figuring it out. It's the wrong choice. It's the wrong time. I have a roadblock. But really gathering it, using it as gathered information instead of, another reason to shame ourselves, because let me tell you, we have no dearth of shame in this culture.
And what I love is getting back to what you said before about kindness. And it's sort of that, like, I like having people, okay, look at like, okay, that happened. And what can I learn from it? Not shaming, not like, oh, I'm so bad, but it's just, it happened. Let's not fight it. Let's see why.
Right.
Why do you keep choosing to have that drink every night?
Right.
Let's learn from that and look at what's influencing us there.
Yeah. And then the other thing I think about too is that, like, life is just shitty sometimes. You know what I mean? Like, sometimes bad things happen, like your children, somebody gets sick, or somebody dies, or you lose your job, or you get food poisoning, or, whatever the thing is. Like, that, life is not easy. Life is complicated and hard. And the older we get, the more complicated and more difficult it is, especially for me, I was 38. Went with a baby, and so now I'm at a certain age, and I have a teenager and an aging mom and a dad who died a couple years ago, and a book that came out. Like, it's been a hard couple of years, and I don't love, you're not going to love your life all the time, but you can make choices to be moving in that direction of alignment, because it's the alignment that is the most important thing, because life happens and we can't change that. And that doesn't mean that we can't find a place of peace on the regular, even in the midst of feeling angry or sad or grieving, right? It's that peace that's really truly about what happens.
Oh, thank you so much for saying that, because it is that, like, we don't need to put a smile on everything. And I'm constantly saying it, life isn't all rainbows and daisies, but when we are living in alignment with our values, if we have a sick parent, or we have a sick kid, or we have a drama at work, or it's our baseline, that bucket is not overflow. We can keep coming for, we have more room in the bucket. We have
more room. That's exactly the goal. Exactly. So we work to get the overall load down, so you have room when life throws life at you.
Yeah, life is going to throw life.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, this show is called what is the show called? I totally forgot. Live Your Life Show? No, Love Your Life Show. Love Your Life Show. Is there anything you do every day to set yourself up for success? Are there certain things that you, like a morning routine, or things that you keep in your schedule that help you?
For me?
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, I got all distracted with your.
Because I forgot the name of the place.
That's, that says a good guest, right? Like, you're deep in conversation, so deep in conversation, right? So for me, I call those, I have a teacher who calls those core routines. And again, the core routines, trying to line those up with what your values are. So for me, the not sleep is a core routine for me, and I'm in the perimenopause time, and so it's not always easy for me to sleep, so I need to be in bed longer in order to get the a night of sleep that I really want to get. I lift weights 3 times a week, and I walk 10,000 steps a day, totally non-negotiable. The only time that I have trouble getting that is when I'm traveling, right? And not when I'm on a trip, but on my travel days when I'm, and I'm like, and then it breaks my streak. I don't like that. Yeah. I'm a streak person. So, and then, of course you go through, like, I had a back injury and I was not able to exercise for a long time. And that was really, really challenging for me. But I had to be like, okay, this is a season right now where this core routine for me, I'm not able to engage in. So what else can I do to kind of take the place of that? Eating healthfully is really, really important for me to feel well. And that doesn't mean that I never eat, candy or something of that ilk, because, if I had diabetes, I might not, but, but being sure that I get lots of protein, and that I, don't eat much sugar and lots of vegetables, that's a core routine for me as far as my self-care. I also, saying no as a practice is really important for me, because historically I've not been good at that. That thing I talked about of being a kid growing up in a town where she was prettiest, thinnest, richest meanest wins,
Yeah.
that kind of set me up to really want people to like me.
Yeah.
And so I tended to be, get myself into difficult situations because of that. And so that's a constant practice for me that is really core for me and my self-care. Um, other things, making sure I have time with my kid, because that's really, really important to me. I was not around a lot when he was little. I always say that my husband was the mom and I was the 50s dad minus the martini. But I'm in a different season now. And so now I'm really trying to, we're switching roles a little bit. He's working more and I'm home more, sometimes to the chagrin of my kid because he wants to be by himself here. I wonder why,
And so for some of those things like the exercise and the sleep, do you mark those in your schedule if it's a priority, or do you?
Yeah. So, for me, I have when my schedule is busy, I do put those in my schedule.
Okay.
When I'm going to a gym, I also put those in my schedule because I've got to go somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
At this juncture, in my head, when I plan the next day, I just do that in my head for the exercise because I'm working out. Actually, this room is a library. It doubles as a gym. I won't spin the camera around, but I have weights over here and a spin bike over there, and I'm actually sitting on my weight bench.
Oh, wonderful.
Right now.
Yeah.
So, I don't always put it in my calendar, but I do have an app called Done that I just love, love, love. I wonder if I can hold that up here, if it'll show. It's an app called Done, and I'm a big fan of things looking pretty, as we talked about with my books up here.
Uh-huh.
And so this app has, you can put in your goals, and then it will turn to the color when you actually click it off and do it. And then it'll track streaks as well. And so the first 3 are free, and then it's like $6 or something to buy it for, it's not a subscription, you just use it. And so that's really helpful for me. It gives me little reminders. And that's something that's really like that kind of, I'm someone who, that kind of accountability is really helpful for me. Another thing, accountability can be a big part of, for me, being successful in making change. When I was working on the book and I had, these big, huge deadlines, it was a lot. I had a full-time job. I was seeing my patients at the clinic. I was seeing online clients. I was still doing freelance work. I had a kid and I was writing the book. So that was a special season. So I had a friend who was, I would text her and be like, I need accountability. And she would say, what do you need to do? How much time it is? And then if I didn't do it, I would need to donate money, a certain amount of money that would hurt, to a cause I hated.
Okay. I love that. My husband did that for a while.
Yeah, it was real. So actually, you can do it online. It's called, I can't remember what it's called there. There's a note in the book. I'll actually pop it in the show notes if people want it, but it's, you can actually do it online and get, put your credit card in. For me, I had a friend who does that. Yeah.
So great. And then because I had seen that in the book and I read it to him because I reminded him that he had done that for
Oh, it's called Stick, STICKK.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And so, for me, I didn't do that, but this friend of mine has been great. And let me tell you, like, I would feel uncomfortable. Oh, and then it was also, if it happened, I would not only have to donate the money, I would have to post it on Facebook that I donated the money.
Oh my gosh.
Like this extra thing of like, to with the organization that's like really antithetical to what I've done.
Right.
I couldn't do it. And I'm also, for me, I'm honest to a T. Like, I wouldn't be able to do it and not report it or do it. This is my nature. It wouldn't be good for, that type of thing isn't good for someone who's just gonna be like, I just didn't do it. Screw it.
Well, I love setting up the structure, and you do mention that in your book, and you reference Gretchen Rubin and her 4 tendencies, and sort of knowing ourselves. That's this whole piece of this is like knowing yourself, knowing how you best work, knowing if that works well for you, or if you're more the rebel and you're like, oh heck no, don't you tell me what to do.
Right.
Something else, or but I think for nothing else, it's to learn about yourself, learn about those kind of pieces. And
I call it your chi of change. Like, how do you make change best? And really being able to, figure out a plan. And again, if you try to do a thing, it doesn't work, like, all right, that's not good for me. And again, if we have these things that we put in place to make the changes, and then we don't make them, maybe it's not the right change to make, or maybe we need additional help and support, or maybe we have some trauma or history thing we need to process, or there's always a reason. People are not late. People are so, I'm just, sometimes the patients will say, well, I didn't do that because I'm lazy. I'm like, no, who's lazy? Like, I mean, lazy is just not really a thing.
No, stop telling yourself that.
Yeah.
And I do love that. And that's a great way to sort of finish up, because it's just this compassion piece, and with a spotlight on the fact that we're all different. So something that Dr. Samantha does may not work for you, or something that I do may not.
Right.
And it's up to you to find out what works best for you.
Yes.
Starting with this book, because the values, exercise, and the feelings, like your desired feelings and your are going to really help get you on this path of conscious living that feels so much better with a lot.
Yeah.
So thank you, Dr. Samantha.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's been really great to be here. I'll make sure that I have lots of links in the show notes for your listeners.
Thank you very much. We're all going to go out there and live a life we love with less overwhelm. Thank you.